everyone, my name is Courtney, and today I'm going to be starting a new reading vlog. So a couple months back in 2020, decided I was going to try and do this little reading/writing project where I was going to read like entire bodies of work, entire discography if you will, of a particular writer. And for that video, for the first video, I did Karen Russell. She is a literary speculative writer, literary fabulous writer. She's just a writer that I've always held really near and dear to my heart as a creative writer. We don't write exactly the same thing, but we have similarities, which has always made me really drawn to her work. And so for this project of reading authors' entire bodies of work, or like reading a good sampling of authors' entire work, I've really been curating a list of fantasy, speculative, sci-fi authors with a literary leaning. Some of them are more genre leaning than others, but for the most part I am doing this as a project to teach myself about writing, read other types of writers that are similar to my own style and genre tastes, which is why I'm leaning towards more literary writings, because that's what I write as a writer, is very speculative, fabulous, literary fiction stuff. I write other genre stuff too, but this is all about curating my reading, getting better at reading things to fill in like the holes of where school doesn't cover these kind of topics as well, and just reading writers that I've been really interested in because I, feel drawn to their writing for whatever reason. So with that preamble out of the way, let's talk about who I'm reading this round. So for this round, I chose Ted Chiang, mostly because he has 2 books of short stories, which makes it really easy to read his stuff because it's not that much. Ted Chiang is a speculative, more sci-fi leaning literary author. He's very well acclaimed, very well loved, and he is most known for his story, which became inspiration for the movie of Arrival. So in a previous class, I read one of the short stories in this book, which was Liking What You See, a documentary. This was such an interesting short story to me, both because it made me think a lot, also just I liked the formatting that he did. This novel was published in 2002, and that story just stuck out to me as just being really progressive even for our times, just really fascinating story. So yes, I'm going to be reading these 2 short story collections and kind of discussing them, what I've learned from them. Hopefully I learned something. Earlier this afternoon, I actually read the first story in this collection, which is Tower of Babylon, which I am still kind of pondering over. We'll get back to that in a minute. But this week is my second to last week in class. I have my last class tonight, and then I have my final class on Tuesday. I technically am graduating at some point, but I'm not going to Zoom graduation, so I don't know how that's working out. Also, in the future, I will probably be on a plane going home at some point so that I can get vaccinated and stuff. So there's a lot going on, but there's also not a lot going on. Graduating, finding a job, but also I'm just sitting in my apartment a lot. It's a very weird time. So let's learn a little bit more about Ted Chiang from his Wikipedia. So Ted Chiang was born in 1967. He is an American science fiction writer. He has won Nebulas, Hugos, John Campbell Award for Best New Writer, Locus Awards, and he is also an artist in residence at University of Notre Dame. I don't know if that's still current. And he is a fictional writer, but he is also a technical writer, but I don't know what specific genre he writes technically for. He does technical writing for the software industry, which is very interesting. And he's also an instructor at the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Workshop. He's been an instructor there, which my dream is to be get to go to Clarion someday. So he's really notably acclaimed for not having a ton of work. What I've read so far, I find really fascinating for the sci-fi genre, so I'm really excited to read more about it. So like I said, I've read the first story and last story in Stories of Your Life and Others. So this is the collection I'm going to be continuing with. I believe this is his first collection. This is the one that has Arrival in it, his first collection. This one came out in 2002, and then this collection is his newest collection, which came out in 2019. So there's a pretty big gap between his stories, because normally if you're publishing a short story collection, that means these have been published previously in magazines. So I'm guessing that he had at least a couple of these published in publications through the late 90s, maybe even early 90s, before it was collected and published in 2001, 2002, and then this collection, same thing, very interesting, and I'm excited to see the progress between these 2 collections. I might look into some interviews just to hear more about him from his own words. But yeah, I'm excited for this. Last time was speculative fiction, fabulous fiction, surrealist fiction, and this time we're going in a lot more hard with sci-fi. He's a very technical sci-fi writer, so there is like a lot of technicalities placed on things. The first story, Tower of Babylon, was really interesting in here because it had like a lot of the technicalities of like building this Tower of Babylon, how they made the clay and the bricks and how the people lived in this world in a sensible way. But then when you get to like Heaven's Gate, I think it's called, which is like the top of the tower where they're trying to like tunnel into heaven, obviously it becomes a lot more surreal as it goes on because they like see the moon and they pass the sun and the stars and everything. So that first story was very interesting. And as far as the first story I read, which was the documentary story, it's very technical, very science-based. It explains everything, but it's so focused on the characters moving and interacting with the science that you pick up on the science stuff and it's important, but it's not necessarily you need to know everything about it. I personally don't always connect with sci-fi stuff, especially when it's very technical, because it's very confusing for me and the science stuff is just a little bit too above me. But I really admire science writers that are, able to focus on the characters, are able to take the science and make it accessible to readers, and I think that's what Ted Chiang is going to be able to achieve with this collection. So yeah, let's get started with this vlog. I have an hour before class, so I'm gonna cook dinner, get ready for class. I'm literally just gonna wear this. I don't care about my appearance anymore. It'll be fine, whatever. But yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. I'm so ready to be done with class. I'm so ready. It's been a hell of a week. Last time we talked, it was Thursday, and now it's Tuesday. Or no, it's Wednesday. It's Wednesday. Yesterday was my last day of classes. It's just been like both hectic and also like I haven't been doing anything because senioritis. Also, I cannot get the exposure on my camera to go up, so I'm really sorry. We're in the dark. You don't need to see my face. It's full of zits. It's bad. But anyway, so this is my last day at my apartment for like now. I'm going home tomorrow, and so today is another hectic day where I have to do laundry, I have to clean, I just have to pack. It's just gonna be hell, but at least I have this and I have an audiobook version of it, so I can read this and then I'll read it on the plane. So hopefully I can get a big chunk of this read. But I am 25% of the way through this by just reading the second story, which is a little bit longer. It's called Understanding, and it's about like people with super intelligence or someone that gains super intelligence. So far, the sci-fi genre, especially the literary genre, is really interesting to me because it seems to be about more suggesting ideas, suggesting things that could happen, possibilities. Sometimes it is exploring and touching on like social issues and different things, but it's more about suggesting the possibility of what would happen. Certain technologies, certain things happened. I prefer my sci-fi to be a little bit closer to social issues, to be a little bit deeper into that, instead of just like exploring the what ifs of technology, to explore the what ifs of like human beings, I guess. I think it will go into that more, but sci-fi is really interesting because, especially Ted Chiang's sci-fi, because it always gets me thinking about things, and I like that about his stories, but also I feel like I don't want it to be different. I just think I would write sci-fi differently, and that other authors have chosen to write sci-fi differently, which is more to my personal taste, but it's getting me thinking, it's getting me intrigued, and that's a big part of sci-fi, so that's good. So yeah, I'm gonna eat a bagel, and then we're gonna go to the laundromat. Fun times. I'm trying out the camera on my new phone, and it looks really good, even when it's just like the flipped around version. But anyway, today is Wednesday, May 5th, and I haven't read anything really, but today is the last day that I have the audiobook, and I've really enjoyed listening to the audiobook while I read along. So that's what I'm going to do today, is to read the last 3 stories of the books. I can finish that off. All morning I've just been like applying to jobs, so I'm ready to not do that and take a break. Anyway, my plan is that I'll read a chapter or I'll read a story, and then when I need a break or when I finish, I will pick up a manga and intersperse my mangas in between that. So that's the plan for this afternoon. Get this book finished up so that we can start the next one and kind of make an analysis, I guess, of Ted Chiang. If not an analysis, just kind of put together my thoughts on this. This is such a clear camera. It looks so good, but I am just so zitty right now. It's bad. Whenever I fly on a plane, my face just breaks out for a week, so that's fun times. But anyway, let's get to reading. Right, my fluffy baby. Yes, It's reading time. Before I start, the other thing I've been doing is yesterday, the day before, I decided it was time to rewatch Haikyuu. I've been watching Haikyuu since it came out in like 2014, 2015, the anime. It's always been very popular, both here and in Japan. It's been very popular, but to see it like blowing up to mainstream proportions is just kind of insane to me. It's really fun in a way, you know, because I've been reading and watching this show for like 7+ years now, something like that. So anyway, I've been just doing a rewatch. I rewatched it last summer for the new season, and I've just been really in the Haikyuu mood, so I've been rewatching it. I'm only on like episode 5. Oikawa is coming like next episode or the episode after, and I'm really excited for it. So I'm going to try and not watch that as best as I can. Just read my book. But yes, let's get started. So I just finished Story of Your Life, and I had 2 longer short stories to read and then one like 2-page story. The 2-page story didn't really do much for me. I don't really know why it was included or, you know, what it was trying to do. It was just way too short. It didn't feel like it was supposed to be a flash fiction piece, if that makes sense. But the other 2 stories were really interesting. One of them was like in a Victorian setting, that there were like automatons and like a magic system of like making things move or come to life kind of. And that story was kind of definitely talking about like eugenics. I found it interesting, but I thought some of the social stuff could have been pushed a little bit more in that. And then the last story I read was Hell is an Absence of God, which is basically God like really exists, but people still don't always like, I mean, they believe he exists, but people don't always like have faith in him. I don't know how to describe it. It's like God exists, angels come down, people get sent to heaven and hell, and people know about it, but they don't always have like religious faith for God anyway. And so the discussion of religion was really interesting in that, because obviously, you know, what happens to religion and people when they know, you know, that they're going to be sent to hell and they can't really, you know, stop it, or, you know, some people try and stop it, some people try to get themselves to heaven, that kind of thing. Yeah, all the stories were really interesting. I will go back on my thought about all the stories and the science fiction elements being very accessible. I think especially the eugenics story, like a lot of it was like a little bit out there and I had a hard time like following the science. I kind of just let it wash over me and didn't really worry about like the specific details as long as I got like the main concept. But I will say for like the more technical, smaller details, I probably don't know what's going on with that. But overall, I would say I didn't like love all the stories in here, but they got me thinking, they got me intrigued. Me personally, I was intrigued by so many of the concepts for the short stories, and so I just wanted it to be pushed a little bit more with the societal aspect, because there could have been more conversations of intersectionality, of like race, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of that in these stories. I thought that the science, the magic, the technical, or, you know, however you want to call it, the science fiction elements, I thought those concepts could be a little bit more integrated with like the real life characters and how they're experiencing it in the real world. And I thought the societal elements could come into conflict with the science a little bit more, and just like, you know, the technicalities of like how reality actually exists if we had more advanced technologies and stuff like that. But overall, like, this was a really interesting collection, especially, you know, for me who's trying to get more into sci-fi, trying to discover what it's all about, and especially like literary sci-fi, where it's doing kind of a little bit of a different thing than like genre sci-fi. Yes, overall, very fascinating collection, especially for a debut collection. It definitely doesn't read like a debut. It reads like someone who's very experienced in writing and knows what they're doing. There's definitely a sense of confidence to this writing style of just being able to tell a story. But I will say my favorite story did end up being the story that was based on Arrival. I just thought it was the strongest emotionally. I connected with the character a little bit more. It just felt very connected to the human aspect, which I preferred. Some of the other stories, they have really good characters, but they tend to feel a little bit distant from them because of the storytelling style. I don't think that's an issue. It's just like personal taste kind of a thing. But yes, overall, very interesting. I'm gonna take a little bit of a break and we'll see when I can get into the next collection. I want to see how much it's changed, because again, this collection was written in like early 2000s and that collection was written in 2019. So I'm excited to see the growth and the changes. But yes, this Ted Chiang read-along is very interesting. So I just finished up Exaltations, the last story I needed to finish. I don't think I vlogged any updates for when I was reading this. I think I just decided that I would update you when I finished all of the stories, but I finished this so we can talk about this one and both of these as a collection. So Exaltations had a lot of similar stories and themes as the first short story collection. There are fictional stories that like touch on or harken back to like old Babylon kind of era stuff. A lot of like references to like God, the Christian God. There are sci-fi stories that deal with technology. And I think until I got to the last story I had to read, I was enjoying this collection more. I felt like technically this was a better collection just because a lot of the stories were a little bit better about focusing in on the characters. I did feel like this was a little bit more technical and I slogged through some of the technical aspects because it just kind of went over my head. But overall, there were more stories I connected to in here because they were a little bit more closely knit to the characters and their like choices. My favorite stories in here were Daisy's Patent Automatic Nanny. That was like about a machine nanny and like nurture versus nature kind of a thing. There was Truth of Fact and Truth of Feeling, which was like about memory and like artificial memory helpers. And then there was The Great Silence, which was just kind of a short, funny analog about like parrots being just as intelligent as humans, just like not able to communicate really. And then the final story in here, which was Anxiety in the Disneyness of Freedom. And this was like where you could see into a parallel universe of like the choices you'd made and like the different, like how your life would end up in these different versions where you picked a different choice. So I thought that was interesting. And then as I was kind of reading along, I kind of wrote down some themes that I noticed that are similar between these two things. So we have a lot of stories about free will. Free will seems to be a very big theme that he likes to touch on. There's a lot about like human nature, nurture versus nature, but also just like what it means to be human living in the world, especially like comparatively to like gods or technology. Again, going back, there's a lot of themes or like stories that push on the idea of like godly power, power over man, again connecting to free will again too. And then of course the relationship of humans and technology and what that means. The final story I had to read in here was the longest story, which was The Life Cycle of Software Objects, which I was initially loving at first. The story is basically about like digital intelligent animals that are kind of like Neopets, I guess, but more intelligent Neopets that you like kind of take care of, and like the two people that really get invested in the project. And I was really, really loving it until it took this turn at the end where it was starting to make commentary or push on the idea of the free will of the beings, especially the free will of them to be able to make choices about their sexuality, or because companies wanted to make them into like sex doll kind of situations and like the autonomy of that. Like it's a lot and I don't want to touch into like all of it because it was really complicated and nuanced. But one of the things that I saw in both of these things is that there's a couple stories in both of these, but there always seems to be a story for Ted Chiang that touches like on the ideas of like sexuality and love in comparison to technology. And it seems, I don't think he's doing a bad job, but it's hard. I'm trying to make this cohesive and make sense. Ted Chiang does a great job with like having different characters with different sexualities and different preferences and different gender identities, but I'm pretty sure he's not queer, and sometimes it seems that he has a little bit of a blind side to queerness in his stories because again, he's touching on subjects of like love, free will, that kind of thing. And when it comes into very obvious sections of like how that deals with sexuality, it seems like it doesn't really delve into those topics in the way that I naturally think that those topics should be explored, especially with asexuality and aromanticism. That was kind of the turning point for when I really didn't end up liking that life cycle story. When it turned bad for me was that it like really completely ignores like the idea of like asexuality, or doesn't really even seem to understand what it really means to be asexual in a world or what it means to be aromantic in the world. There was a story in here that I thought, you know, obviously lended itself to the idea of asexuality and aromanticism, and it kind of waves that thing away. And I think it's so interesting because he uses those words in here. Like those words are in both of the stories that I had problems with, and it like kind of touches on it but kind of just waves it away instead of really fully understanding the sexuality and like kind of unpacking it in a place where it seems to naturally be coming into the story. And it's like, you know, if you're just gonna touch on it and brush it aside, like why even bring it up? I've never loved stories about how AI interacts with sexuality and love. Like I really hate stories where like a guy falls in love with like a computer. Like I hate it so much. And I think eventually I will write a story about that in my own writing, just because it really does peeve me about the way that it works in stories, if that makes sense. But I don't want to get into my like soapbox right now because I don't need to do that. But yeah, these stories, all of them are just so nuanced and interesting, and in my mind, Ted Chiang has very clear things that really interest him that he wants to explore in his stories, such as like free will, what it means to have free will, and like the intersection of human will and technology, and human will and like other powers. And I think that kind of appears in his character work, because I think his characters are really strong and really well done, and I can see that they've developed so far since his first collection, but there is a little bit of distance between the characters as the concepts and the technology seem to take the main focus of every single story. The strongest stories for me are the ones where the characters seem a little bit stronger than the concepts themselves, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. It's just like personal preference of what you want out of sci-fi stories, and for me, I want the characters above all else, whereas it seems like Ted Chiang is really interested in like themes, technology, and like concepts, big concepts. So for me, I always just found his stories a little bit lacking because I wanted them to delve into like the realities of what these things be like. And in an extent they do, but he touches on like concepts and things that I find fascinating and interesting and like to ponder on, but he just doesn't explore them in the same ways that I would, which is like completely valid. Like that's just personal writing. And obviously a lot of people are interested in how Ted Chiang writes, what he writes about. It's just a personal preference thing at the end of the day. You know, I'm a different writer, so I would write about different things, and that completely makes sense, valid, all of that. At the end of the day, separating like my own personal feelings about some of these stories, you know, these are both solid sci-fi, fantasy, genre, literary fiction reads. I think that these are really strong short stories. Since he's been writing, he hasn't really published like a ton, like this is really it. There is a level of craft in here that's really excellent to read, especially as a genre writer myself. I think I'm getting a lot from both of these collections and just how you can explore ideas in so different ways. I'm also a writer who's very much connected to very specific ideas and themes and concepts. And so to see that, you know, him having very set ideas and concepts, but see them explored in so many different kinds of stories in so many different kind of ways is so interesting and fascinating to me, because it's something I do in my stories as well. As far as craft, he does something so well and so well crafted, just in a totally different way than I would approach something. So I think that this was really good for me to read as a writer. These weren't like all perfect stories for me. They did take me a little bit of time to get through. They are pretty technical, pretty dense, but in the end, I do think it was really well worth it to read this. And I really love just like the idea of approaching a genre that I explore in like a very different craft way. So I think that's really, really fascinating and interesting. But yes, again, it took me way longer than I anticipated, a lot longer than I wanted this vlog to go on. But at the end of the day, I was successful in completing an entire author's discography again, which was really fun. And I'm hoping that my exploration of Ted Chiang was in any way beneficial to, you know, other readers who are interested in him, other writers that are interested in him. And I hope to do another vlog like this exploring another writer soon, because this is always just so beneficial to my own writing. But thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys later, and happy reading.